In 1928, Catherine Donahue, a former watch dial painter, testified in court with her jaw wired shut, the result of years of radiation poisoning that had disintegrated her jawbone, leaving her unable to speak above a whisper. This was just the beginning of a dark conspiracy that would expose the horrific treatment of hundreds of women, known as the Radium Girls, who were slowly poisoned by their employers. These women, mostly teenagers, were hired to paint watch faces with glow-in-the-dark paint containing radium, a highly toxic and radioactive substance. They were told to wet their brushes with their tongues to achieve a fine point, unaware that they were ingesting small amounts of radium every day. The Radium Girls worked for companies like the United States Radium Corporation and the Waterbury Clock Company, painting watch faces in factories in Orange, New Jersey, and Waterbury, Connecticut. During the early 1900s, the women were mostly immigrants, eager to work and support their families, and they were paid relatively well, around $18 per week, a decent wage at the time. But here's where it gets dark. The companies knew that radium was highly toxic and had already taken precautions to protect the male workers who handled the substance, providing them with masks and gloves. However, the women were not given any protection, and their bosses even encouraged them to moisten their brushes with their tongues, claiming it would help them work more efficiently. And this is where everything fell apart. As the women began to fall ill, their employers denied any responsibility, claiming that the radium was harmless. As the years went by, more and more women began to suffer from radiation poisoning, experiencing severe health problems, including anemia, bone cancer, and necrosis of the jaw, a condition that would eventually become known as radium jaw. Nobody talks about this part, but the women's bodies were literally disintegrating, their bones crumbling, and their jaws rotting away. The first reported case was in 1924, when a former dial painter, Margaret Fitzpatrick, visited a doctor complaining of severe pain in her jaw and teeth. The doctor was shocked to discover that her jawbone was disintegrating, and soon, more women came forward with similar symptoms. The companies, however, continued to deny any wrongdoing, and it wasn't until 1927 that the first lawsuit was filed. On behalf of 5 former dial painters, including Catherine Donahue. But here's the thing, the companies had been aware of the dangers of radium since 1906, when a scientist named Marie Curie had discovered its toxic properties. In fact, the United States Radium Corporation had even hired a scientist to study the effects of radium on the human body, and the results were alarming. However, the company chose to ignore the warnings and continued to expose the women to the deadly substance. And this is where the story takes a turn. The women, despite their suffering, decided to fight back, and their courage would change labor law history forever. In 1928, Catherine Donahue and her colleagues took their case to court, and the trial was a sensation, with newspapers across the country covering the story of the Radium Girls. The women's testimony was heartbreaking, and their bravery was inspiring, but the companies were still unwilling to accept responsibility. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the companies had been engaged in a massive cover-up, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. The women had kept detailed records of their illnesses, and their doctors had documented the horrific effects of radiation poisoning. The companies, however, continued to deny any wrongdoing, and their lawyers used every trick in the book to discredit the women. But the women refused to back down, and their determination paid off. In 1928, the court ruled in their favor, awarding them a significant settlement. And this is where the story gets even darker. The companies were forced to pay the women's medical bills, but they also made sure that the women would never work again, using their influence to blacklist them from the industry. The women's victory was bittersweet, as they had won their case, but at a great personal cost. The Radium Girls case was a landmark moment in labor law history, as it exposed the horrific treatment of workers, particularly women. In the early 20th century, the case led to significant changes in labor laws. including the establishment of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in 1971. The Radium Girls' bravery also inspired a new wave of women's rights activism, as women began to demand better working conditions, fair wages, and greater protection from industrial disasters. Nobody talks about this part, but the Radium Girls case was also a catalyst for the women's suffrage movement, as women realized that they needed to fight for their rights, both in the workplace and in the voting booth. And this is where the story comes full circle. The Radium Girls case was a dark moment in American history, but it also marked a turning point in the fight for women's rights and labor law reform. The Radium Girls' legacy extends far beyond their own case, as their bravery and determination inspired a new generation of activists and workers. Today, their story is remembered as a cautionary tale about the dangers of industrial neglect and the importance of protecting workers' rights. The case also highlights the importance of women's rights and the need for greater protection for women in the workplace. And this is where the story ends, with a sense of hope and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward. The Radium Girls story is a testament to the power of courage and determination, and it serves as a reminder that we must always fight for justice and equality. Subscribe for more stories like this, and join us next time as we explore another dark chapter in history.